Dear colleagues, dear friends, dear students, it's a big pleasure for us to welcome you all here today for the inaugural speech of the Boğaziçi lecture series, originated and organized to mark and celebrate 150 years of academic tradition on this campus. Thank you all for joining us at this very inspiring event. Leading scholars, eminent scientists and intellectuals will be invited to the Boğaziçi lecture series to discuss political, social, cultural, and scientific issues and developments. We sincerely hope that the series becomes a successful and enduring tradition, reaffirming Boğaziçi University's position as a focal point for breakthrough debates on contemporary, local, and global issues. We believe that it's absolutely crucial for institutions of higher education to both think and talk about the public at large and the public mission of universities, especially given that the future and fate of Turkish universities are being discussed at length. We could not have asked for a more distinguished guest speaker than Professor Craig Calhoun to launch Boğaziçi lecture series with such a vital topic. Professor Calhoun has devoted his career to thinking about, researching, writing, and lecturing on issues related to social movement, collective action, and public universities. I would like to thank gratefully and very sincerely thank him for accepting our invitation to this event. I would also like to take this opportunity to wish us all a very pleasant autumn and a very successful academic year. I sincerely believe that we will continue to work together to sustain Boğaziçi University's 150-year-old tradition of academic excellence well into the future. Now I will leave the floor to my dear provost, Ali Tekcan, to introduce our very distinguished guest speaker. Thanks so much for being with us today. Yes, Ali.
Thank you. It's a privilege and a pleasure to welcome Professor Craig Calhoun to Boğaziçi University to deliver the inaugural lecture of Boğaziçi Lecture Series. My task is to introduce Professor Calhoun in a timely manner, but considering his CV, that's a very daunting task actually, but I'll give it a shot and try to do it. Professor Calhoun has a BA from University of Southern California, then has received an MA degree in economics from Manchester University, then received his doctoral degree in sociology and modern social and economic history at Oxford University. He taught at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for approximately 20 years, where he also served as Dean of Graduate School, and as well as founding the University Center for International Studies. Then he chaired the sociology department at NYU and became the director of the Institute of Public Knowledge, which is a center fostering interdisciplinary research. From 1999 to 2012, he has also been the president of Social Science Research Council. And since September 2012, he has been the director of London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Calhoun is also a leading and a truly interdisciplinary scholar who has written more than 100 articles and chapters, as well as a number of books on nationalism, community, social movements, public sphere, and education, among other topics. His books include Neither Gods Nor Emperors, which deals with the 1989 Tiananmen Square student protest. Some of you may remember the different images from that historical event. His most recent book is The Roots of Radicalism, published by the University of Chicago Press. I might add that his most recent article, or the one that I'm aware of, titled Occupy Wall Street in Perspective, provides a different perspective of looking at things we have experienced on this campus as well as in the city in the last couple of years. Professor Calhoun's work is also known for its emphasis on the potential impact of science, especially social science, on the public sphere. Before actually inviting him to the stage, I also would like to remind you, and then you can distribute that knowledge to information to others as well. This talk, the video recording as well as the podcast of this talk will be available in a couple of weeks on the website of the 150th year celebrations. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Craig Calhoun to give his talk.
Well, thank you all for being here, and special thanks to the rector and the provost for the lovely introduction and, above all, simply the invitation to be here. May I thank also my friend Jalal Kedar, who is the person who first wrote me on behalf of Boğaziçi to extend this invitation. It is a particular pleasure to speak at Boğaziçi, a university I have visited before, but which I have known even more through a number of its graduates who have gone on in a variety of ways to distinguished careers, have influenced me as a scholar, and some of whom who have been my students, and in all of these ways given an extraordinarily favorable image of Boğaziçi for me. In addition to the fact that friends and students have been educated and taught here, I'm aware of Boğaziçi's exceptional public role in Turkey, its general excellence as a university, but the fact that it has played a distinctive public role. And my desire to speak about the public mission of the university reflects both my sense that this is important here and my more general concern about this issue. It's a great honor to inaugurate this lecture series for the 150th anniversary of Boğaziçi. But let me note that this very statement reveals a first ambiguity of many in the idea of speaking about the public mission of a university, or the idea of a public university. For, as you all know, the first 110 years or so of its extraordinary history, Boğaziçi was not yet Boğaziçi, but Robert College, and not primarily funded or owned by the Turkish government. It received a foundational decree from the Sultan, though in fact it opened its doors 6 years before that decree was actually granted. So 1863 is the foundational year we celebrate of an institution that has changed its form, its character, and its funding over time, but sought to preserve a number of ideals through that history. And this is, in a sense, at the heart of what I want to discuss. I think that universities, which often have radical faculty members, are conservative institutions. That in many ways, we like the way we do things. We became academics in universities because we liked being students in universities. And we like carrying on many of the things we value. Now, many of these values are, I think, extremely important in differentiating core values that we wish to sustain and more instrumental practices that can be changed as part of the basis for securing the core values is important. So a commitment to intellectual freedom, for example, can be enshrined and guarded in various different ways, and it inevitably changes because the pressures that are exerted against intellectual freedom may be different. They may be threats of government censorship. They may also be economic pressures that push for changes in what is taught or what is said in universities, or who is hired to university faculties, so that there's no simple continuity. And I think part of the situation, the challenge of the universities that we find today is continually searching for ways to protect core value commitments and to engage key issues in society on the basis of those value commitments, while being willing to adapt and adjust in some other ways. and this is hard. We occasionally find ourselves protecting our institutional structures and forgetting the underlying values or purposes. And so there's no automatic way in which this works. Boğaziçi as a university now states its mission, this idea of a public mission, succinctly and clearly. And the priorities are very much those of a public mission. Boğaziçi says, we are educating individuals who endorse our institutional values, who respect ethical standards, who are environmentally conscious, who can think critically, and who with their academic and cultural formation and self-confidence are versatile, creative, and capable of being successfully employed in academic institutions and in public or private sectors. Secondly, generating universal knowledge and contributing to critical thinking, science, and technology while serving humanity. And third, expanding the scientific horizons in Turkey and contributing to the institutionalization of science, art, and culture in our society. Now, this is an exceptional vision. It's an important mission to pursue. And you can think of this in the background to the talk, because what I want to suggest today is that there has been a kind of structural transformation in the place of universities in modern societies that creates both challenges to missions, such as Boğaziçi, and reasons to take them seriously, to have a renewed sense of mission or purpose. This isn't all good or bad, then. This isn't simply a story of decline and fall in which the end is, well, the university, it was a nice thing while it lasted, but it's gone. Nor is it simply a celebration that says there should be an untouched continuity. It's a mixture. Now, let me introduce this by saying that I have three big influences writing this talk. Jürgen Habermas, Pierre Bourdieu, and my current job. And I'm going to try to relate something from each of them as I situate them. Jürgen Habermas, many of you will know, a German social theorist, critical theorist, who among other works wrote a book on the structural transformation of the public sphere. And what was at issue in that book, and what I want to connect to this talk about the university, is the extent to which democracy depended on publicness, okay, first off. So democracy wasn't just majority votes, it depended on a public realm in which people were both free and able to express their different critical opinions about society, to debate each other about what the public good was, and by carrying out that debate, actually shape that public good, actually determine what it should be. Because the public good wasn't something that was objectively present, it was something that had to be developed and understood by the public. So Habermas, in many ways, idealized 18th century European public debates, and he wrote about the formation of people in largely private settings to become able to participate in public debates, which were crucial to democracy. Now, at this point, we're not speaking yet about actual electoral democracy in any of the settings that Habermas talked about. It's worth repeating. That's a much later development in European history. But we're speaking about the formation of public opinion. I stress this on both sides of this because they bear on universities. Universities are realms of freedom for the expression of opinion, and they thrive because it's possible to have that free intellectual exchange. But they are also means for enabling people to develop educated public opinion, to create and improve public opinion. Think of the difference between conducting an opinion poll among the members of an uneducated population and creating the possibility for debates informed by scholarship and learning and science, which debates represent different opinions among people who also change their opinions in the course of debate. So universities are important both for the education of public opinion and the individuals who participate in the debate, and for that free setting of the debate. But now let me continue with the Habermas story, because it is in many ways a story of a problem built into that formation of the public sphere, and I think we see certain similar issues with universities today. The problem was that the idea of publicness involved a commitment to expansion and openness. The public sphere should get larger. The elite characteristic of early public debates should be reduced as there was an expansion to broader publics. But, said Habermas, the expansion came in a form which undermined many of the things that were good about the original version of the public sphere. As it expanded into mass democracy, there were the use of advertising techniques and manipulation through the media, and large organizations played a different role, and there was sometimes a collapsing of the relation between public and private. I don't want to go on with the general story of Habermas and democracy, but I want to take from that an idea that is important to think about universities. The idea that we have potentially commitments that are in tension with each other. We face structural transformations as we try to work out these commitments. A commitment, for example, to openness, that there should be more and more people educated to the university level throughout society, that our debates should be very open, that everyone should be able to participate in them, and at the same time, a commitment to the quality of debate and a dependence on partial autonomy in society. Now, I think I don't have to speak at length about this because I think on reflection you should recognize this from very personal experience, that universities depend in part on some level of autonomy from the society around them in order to conduct their work, to conduct their debates, to do the science and the broader discussions of the university. At the same time, universities seek to reach out into the society and are part of a broad view that knowledge should be self-expanding, that it should be a public good, that we should be able to reach out and include more. The tension is that the very factors that are part of broader inclusion change the character of the university. I'll say more in a more specific way, but let me foreshadow with two comments. One of them is to think of this, in a sense, economically and institutionally. That is, the expansion of higher education in a society is a cost, demands resources, and the universities become entangled in a variety of state and market considerations, securing those resources to become larger, and a field of higher education emerges which is extremely hierarchical, internally differentiated, and competitive in ways that are not all congruent with that original idea of an open scientific debate. So that we end up with an institutional structure which we manage and depend on, but which we also recognize sometimes as challenging our debate. From the economy and from the market and the sheer cost of doing it. Since, sadly, neither the founder of Robert College, right, nor other university founders has ever endowed them with enough money not to need more money. Okay. Now the state is the second sort of challenge, sometimes simply a funder alongside private funding, but always a funder with particular agendas and agendas that are not only those of universities. And that may be in perfectly benign ways, as the state says, well, for economic growth, we need more engineers. But then do they say we need fewer physicists and fewer chemists? And what does that mean for the university's ability to determine the curricula, the faculty, and the nature of knowledge? Okay? And it's also potentially in ways that are more politically charged about the character of academic life. And yet the state is the arena often in which the university seeks to have its influence. So what I want to evoke is simply a sense that universities work partly by balancing contending forces and contending pressures. And there is no easy resolution to these because universities depend on resources and they depend on social conditions being made available for their relatively autonomous work. There is no denial of this. It would be nice if we could say, oh no, we don't need money, right? We don't need political permission. The university is completely autonomous of market and state to pursue its own goods, but it isn't. So everything's about how we manage that. And as in Habermas's story, how we manage that produces structural transformations. I'll say more, but I alluded to one of them by the introduction of hierarchy into this. The fact that there's not just a university with its missions, but Boğaziçi, as all other universities, is implicated in a larger hierarchy. And that matters now in societies that have become much more unequal and unequal in new ways, and in which there's a global competition and this hierarchy in the larger systems. Now, I said another inspiration was Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist. Let me draw momentarily from him to complete this introduction. Bourdieu, among other things, wrote about an idea of social fields that I want to borrow to talk about universities. Though we think of each of our universities often sort of standing alone, universities are in an academic field. We hire new PhDs who got their degrees elsewhere. We send our undergraduates out to get graduate degrees. We go off to conferences with our fellow academics. We teach work that has been generated elsewhere. We don't produce all the knowledge. We write about creating knowledge as central to our mission, yet most of the knowledge we work to transmit to our students, we didn't create ourselves at any one place. We are part of a larger field. We can use field sort of loosely, but I want to draw from Bourdieu a little bit more meaning that has to do with this idea of balancing state and market, or political power and economic power in relation. Bourdieu wrote about the development of modern societies as the development of, if you will, fielded societies, societies organized into fields in which there was semi-autonomy. So a legal field, which had judges and lawyers and its own internal hierarchy and its own reputational power based on who was thought to understand the law best and who had positions, right? And in that legal field, the extent to which there was or wasn't relative independence of government and market. That is, the judges couldn't be bought and the judges couldn't be told what to say by politicians. So the legal field became important, it mattered precisely by that relative autonomy. And there were other fields, religious field or educational field and so forth. Academia, the university field, I think, is importantly shaped by this. I've already sort of introduced the idea, but by this imperfect achievement. Bourdieu wrote about this at first in largely a critical vein during the period when France, indeed most of the richer countries of the world, enjoyed a long boom after World War II, which the economies grew fairly rapidly. There was an expansion of the university sector, as of most other sectors in these societies, and there was an ideology that this was all about opportunity for everyone. And what Bourdieu devoted his life's work to showing, much of it, was that the opportunity was organized in a way that inscribed a new inequality, which shared a great deal with the previous inequality, but changed it somewhat. So if in a society like France, it went from a situation where 6% of children went to university to a society where nearly 50% went to university, that a new hierarchy emerged about which university you went to and what you studied, not just the university-educated or an elite. Turkey's gone through a partially similar transformation. Turkey's gone through a boom, and one of the questions is what continues and what comes out of that. I'm not going to try to pretend to be an expert on Turkey, but I think that these are broad and general issues that we look at and we see that universities, in their pursuit of academic excellence and quality, implicate themselves in the production and reproduction of social inequality. That is, recruiting the best students is hard to distinguish from recruiting an elite, and consecrating members of that elite, those whose parents were able to give them the best earlier education, as the best. Okay? So notice that I'm not saying, oh, this is a bad thing the university could just stop doing. It's not as though the university could easily opt out of selective admissions. Right? There are many applicants, selections have to be made. One of the fairest ways to do it is on the basis of apparent academic ability, but Bourdieu is pointing out it implicates the university in a reproduction of social inequality. And the university system, the university field, is heavily tied into a reproduction of inequality around the world. So it produces knowledge, right? And people in universities may write books promoting equal access to knowledge, promoting social change and equality, but the university system, nonetheless, is implicated in this larger field of inequality. Within the university system, there is a good deal of inequality as well, between the better and worse paid, between the people who are most influential in their disciplines and fields and those who are least influential, simply by age and rank. Okay? There are a variety of inequalities. And again, this may not be bad, and it may not be easily avoidable, but it's worth reflecting on. Now, to push again the idea of a contemporary reflection on this for a moment, the inequality has grown dramatically. And I said that my third influence is my current job as the director, president of the LSE. Right? Well, one of the things that gives me knowledge of is, say, the salaries of all the faculty members. And I knew this actually at my previous university, and I did some research on this. One of the trends in universities is towards dramatically greater variation in academic salaries, more inequality. This is directly linked to market influences, since people can come. I'm sure this never happens here, but at my universities, faculty members come in to the offices of key administrators and say things like, "I've got this great offer from the University of Pennsylvania. What are you going to do about it?" Now, I say things like, "Oh, you don't want to live in Pennsylvania." And I try to explain why that would be a bad choice, but I'm also sometimes pushed to provide resources of one kind or another. It may be salary, but it may be, oh, I need this resource for my research, I need this extra student that could be supported. There are a variety of ways. Now, my point about this, again, isn't that there's an easy way out or it's just good or bad, but that it's a change. Now, let me go from these, right, Habermas, Bourdieu, my own job, just evoked, into a little bit broader version of the story, noting that these things are, I'm going to try to say, not idiosyncratic and are embedded in a larger political economy and a history. Foreshadow one simple part of it. In every OECD country, all of the richer countries of the world, equality, by and large, by most measures, grew from the end of World War II to the mid-1970s recession, an economic crisis, and has declined since. That is, for the last 40 years, inequality has grown. Okay? And that's affected every sector, every field. It's grown among lawyers, it's grown among doctors, and it's grown in the university. And it's something we have to recognize and manage. We have to make sure that we don't have more of it than we intend to or than we can avoid, but also that we manage it on fair bases and so forth. But it becomes a fact of our lives, and a fact that is at odds with much of our understanding of intellectual community. So we live every day with competing ideals. We are all equals in this. We're intellectuals in an intellectual community engaged in free exchange, and ideas are what determine everything. Right? And there's a great deal of inequality, and some of that inequality reflects intellectual performance, having more ideas or publishing more good research. Some of it reflects the demand for different fields, and different fields even within a discipline. Within the field of economics, macroeconomics a generation ago was nearly dead. Right? It was in the doldrums. It was one of the harder fields to get big academic jobs with, still somewhat in demand outside academia, bank strategy units or things. It's enjoyed a comeback. It's one of the hottest fields in economics now. Right? I'm of just the age, that those of you who are in your 60s will know, when you took economics, if you studied economics as an undergraduate, it started with macroeconomics and worked down. Then there was a revolution and everything was micro up, right? A restructuring. Fields go in and out of fashion. I won't continue with my discussion of economics, but I will just note economists are the ones most likely to come into my office saying that they have an offer at the university somewhere else. So I'm aware of which fields of economics are hot. Right? Now, which fields are hot is different from which individual is, in fact, performing more brilliantly. So there's no way around that. I can't say, well, I've decided not to pay what the market requires in this field, but it's a problem if I do say simply that we're going to pay the market price, right? That's the structural tension. Now, this is reflected outside the university in the fact that part of what society demands, part of what pays our bills, what creates the possibility of doing the things that we love doing as intellectuals and doing the work of education that we value, is economic contributions universities make a variety of economic contributions to larger societies. They're responsible for general social dynamism, for technology-led growth. Right? They are responsible for individuals getting ahead and having better careers in society. So there are a variety of kinds of economic contributions, almost all of which work as private goods, and almost all of which you could imagine being organized entirely as private goods. I'll come back to an exception around knowledge as a public good and broad platforms of innovation and things. But most of this could be. That is, you could look at education and the education of students overwhelmingly as a private good. Individual students get good education and they use it to have successful careers. Not only could you imagine this, you can look around and see it, because this is increasingly the way entrants to universities think about what they're coming to universities for, and this is increasingly the way parents look at what they're paying the fees of universities for. There is a broad trend around much of the world, right, for more narrow and instrumental educational programs at universities to prepare people for lucrative careers. Okay. It's reflected in market forces. It's reflected by states. You look at China and you say China's decided to invest enormously in higher education, broadly a good thing, but you look at what it's actually investing in and you see an extremely skewed organization of that funding. Turns out it's investing a lot less in, say, history and anthropology than engineering and business. And again, I know this wouldn't happen here, but it happens all over, frankly, right? It happens sometimes pushed by students and their parents who say, if we're going to have to pay, in my university, if British students are going to have to pay £9,000 a year, and they're going to carry loans when they graduate, they want careers that enable them to pay off those loans. Nothing irrational or unpredictable about that. Yet, it leads them to want to study certain subjects. If we responded entirely to market pressures at the LSE, we would basically be teaching economics, finance, and management. Maybe a few people would take international relations. Law would still be around, right? Anthropology, history, philosophy, variety of subjects, not. Okay? Now, the LSE has the relatively privileged position that it has extraordinary applicants. For our lowest field, that is the department with the lowest ratio of applicants to places, it's 9-to-1. So we're not in danger. And yet that's the reproduction of the inequality of the system. That is us highly placed in a system. There are others, other pressure. And that pressure becomes felt, that market pressure, throughout the system, but more acutely as you move somewhat down the hierarchy of the universities. But then it reshapes the opportunities for education, the opportunities to participate in broader thinking and broader social exploration, and where they are offered, whether they are part of the reproduction of the elite or the empowerment of everybody else in the larger society. Let me sort of continue. So the providing of training and credentials to advance individual careers can be interpreted in very narrow ways and can be a pressure on universities to offer degrees that can be appropriated as private goods. So can providing exclusive markets of status. Another way to think about what universities do is they provide people with credentials that will impress future fathers-in-law. All right? Big thing, don't, you know, right? That is, not simply that there's a marriage market at the university, right? But that graduates of Boğaziçi are, you know, more attractive to those future father-in-laws. than graduates of the many places or those who don't graduate at all. And this is, again, a reality, but it's appropriable as a private good, a public good. Even producing inventions that entrepreneurs can patent and make the basis of companies, right, is often, now almost always, structured as a matter of private goods. It's even hard to remember that this was largely a change. But as a small digression to make the point, many of the largest entrepreneurial fortunes that have emerged in the world in the last 40 years, the new billionaires that are so famous, are rooted in science that was made publicly available before that. It's no accident that Microsoft, Apple, so many other of these Silicon Valley companies date from the 1970s, founded respectively in 1976 and 1975, right? This was a transitional period. During that post-war boom that I referred to before, there was enormous governmental invention in science, which was mostly not restricted from the public access. The policy was the government had paid for science, it should be publicly available. The commercialization of this science, that which made possible the new electronic industries, for example, and much new biotech and other things, created huge commercial opportunities from the 1970s on. But they were ones which created billionaires and were part of a growing social inequality rather than the growing social equality before. They were a shift. And they then had an impact on the universities, which began to create offices of technology transfer and other sorts of apparatuses to try to make sure that they were able to patent and share in the commercial benefits of the work of their faculty. Again, as I keep saying throughout this wasn't easily avoidable. It wasn't like, oh, those bad university presidents back in the 1970s just did this perniciously. But it was a larger social trend, a trend towards the private appropriation of knowledge that is in significant tension with part of what we value in the university, the idea of knowledge as a public good that we share and openly debate. It's an interesting piece of research on this in which a sociologist, a pair of sociologists, Stanford and Michigan, studied scientists in universities and scientists in private business, pharmaceutical research companies, for example. And the long-standing understanding had been that the ones in the universities were the best and the happiest, that they enjoyed a great deal of freedom to pursue blue sky research, brand new ideas, break the frontiers of knowledge, win Nobel Prizes, and so forth. Okay? Some of you will remember Robert Merton's account of science as based on a prestige system rather than an economy. What they found was, in this period, since the 1970s, the scientists in universities were less happy and felt that they were less able to be free as scientists than those in the big research and development arms of corporations. Why? Because in the universities, they were put in a situation of constant competition in a hierarchical relationship, and they felt they were able to share less. And they followed this up with research on how much scientists with labs near each other actually shared. And in universities, they found they were less likely to help each other out. When there was a matter of expertise with a particular piece of equipment, or in fact, you needed to borrow a piece of equipment, the university-based scientists were more likely to say no or make an excuse than the corporate scientists who, among other things, shared in the benefits of all of the science in the corporation through profit-sharing schemes and things like this. So it was a reversal of what was expected in knowledge. And what I want to note is it suggests universities coping poorly with the new situation, right? Creating an internal environment in the university in which everybody is treating their bits of knowledge as private property to compete with each other, to get their sole-authored articles in the refereed journals and improve their internal position in this. Now, it's not that those big companies were communistic, but that they had created mechanisms to ensure that all their members felt some common interest in outcomes. And we in universities haven't always created those mechanisms, and it's important for us to find them. If we are to be internally a public, that is not just good participants out in broader society, but inside in our own numbers, an active, effective public square where people engage with each other, where people share ideas with each other, this requires institutional support. And as universities have gotten larger, as their financial circumstances have changed, we've often allowed this to be eroded inside universities. We've created a situation in which the intellectuals are competitors with each other more than sharers or collaborators. And of course, there are things that can be done about this. Even when we think about fairness in an issue like admissions to universities, we tend to think about this very largely as a matter of the fair distribution of private benefits of higher education, impressing the father-in-law, getting the job, all of those things. It seems hard to keep the public goods and public missions in mind. Boğaziçi states these very clearly up front, which is a start in this, right? And one of the things, I think quite seriously as a start, is being articulate about our public mission, what we're trying to achieve. And I think it's crucial in a period when there are new and very strong external pressures, and they're not going to get easier. So my prediction is, right, that we have been in a period of significant change, and there's going to be an intensification of pressures from both markets and states in different ways, and that we will be able to protect our values only if we're clear about what those values are, right? But then only if we have the will, not just to say that, but to turn it into institutional practices. And they won't turn out simply always to be the old practices. In the US, right, the tenure system for faculty members is under a good deal of pressure. The tenure system was developed in the early 20th century in its modern form in the US, it's not from all time, to protect against external imposed censorship or threats to free speech. Sometimes it operates as an age discrimination system, when there are very few jobs for the young and there is an entitlement to an unusual amount of job security for the old. So one of the things that we have to ask ourselves in the system is an institution that had a good, clear purpose working as well in new circumstances as it may have done previously? What does it mean if we create a system of tenure at a time when it was created, the early years of it, about 20% of faculty, initially only full professors, right? And it becomes the majority of the faculty in a mechanism that keeps out new entrants. Right? Well, it means something different. We may decide we still wish to defend it. We may decide we wish to modify it. But if we do nothing, we'll do what's happened in many places, which is see it die. And I think it is de facto dying in lots of universities because of the way it works, because universities hire more and more people who are off the tenure track faculty and appointed in some other kind of employment relationship. Right? New entrants are less likely to have the prospects of tenure. In the sciences, people spend more and more years in postdocs before they're able to get onto tenure track ladders and so forth. Right? If we think there's something important to protect, we're going to have to think of some other mechanisms to protect it. Right? The basic point. Now, as faculty members, I think that we are not above some of the baser motivations in all of this. We can be really motivated crassly by economic factors, though by and large we aren't, or we wouldn't have become university professors in the first place. Right? But we're very motivated by various issues of pride, position, prestige. And we sometimes let these translate into the idea that we have our positions because we did really well on our exams when we were students. Right? That it's a kind of entitlement based on our own superior performance earlier, which forgets that that basically is not the reason anyone is paying the bills. Neither market nor state is saying, we wish to give lifetime employment to people who did well on their exams. Right? They are saying, we wish certain kinds of contributions. Right? We wish technologies. That can be the basis of economic growth. We wish educated students who can be the basis of citizenship as well as economic activities. They have agendas. Right? Our ability to manage the system depends on our ability to take seriously those agendas and then try to balance and to achieve within that. So we face a world in which the private way of thinking about knowledge and almost everything else has grown dramatically. I don't have time to try to detail it, but it's grown partly because of us, right? In an ironic way. That is, if anyone ever asks you whether academic research has public impacts or whether it just stays in little circles of academics, think about the broad, individualistic, private property turn that had at its center University of Chicago economics faculty, but also a variety of other intellectuals, Friedrich von Hayek from the LSE, or the movements like the Monte Pelerin Society and so forth. A movement that in many ways a very successful, largely intellectually brilliant movement that started with the suggestion that the private was natural and the public was artificial, that it was normal to have private property and some sort of distortion to do things by the means of public goods or public ownership. In that. A reversal that has gained greater and greater impact since the 1970s. It's not simply an eternal characteristic of people, like selfishness in general. It is a change in an overall way of thought, overall intellectual culture and broader societal and political culture in many parts of the world. Just as there are changes in the relation between religion and secularism, or changes in the way in which people think about whether new technologies are all a part of progress or often risky. There are changes in these intellectual cultures. They're promoted, they're brought about. Well, one of those changes is a large increase in the extent to which we work with the assumption of privatized goods and private controls. Now, let me turn, before I close, to say something about what are the public purposes. What I've mostly detailed is the pressures on us, pressures from state market, the pressures from our own expansion, increased internal hierarchy and differentiation, and the pressures, I evoked briefly, from a sort of changed culture almost of thinking about it. Right? Now, what are the public purposes? Some of that has to do with why governments invest in universities, but government isn't the public. And part of what our issue is to be clear what we think we offer the public. For example, in the Boğaziçi mission statement, there are references to things like a high standard of ethics, an environmental awareness. Right? These stem, I think, I don't know the history of the Boğaziçi mission statement enough, but they stem, and similar statements elsewhere, from intellectual work, from analyses. We say this about the environment because scientists have done studies, because we understand that it has an impact. It's not simply a personal statement of taste. Right? It is an expression of the idea that the university has generated knowledge which needs to have a greater impact in society, that societies around the world are failing to take environmental issues seriously enough, and therefore it is part of the public contribution of the university to make sure that students understand these well enough that they are able to be effectively involved in public, pursuing the public good of a safer, less environmentally endangered planet. Okay? Now, we could say that on other fronts, ethical fronts. Probably always a good idea to be ethical. Why is it frequently now brought to the fore? Because we see a variety of examples of major social problems produced by unethical behavior, because there's enormous power concentrated in the hands of individuals who can make unethical or ethical decisions, that we are fairly clear that in our world, right, we can't transform everything, but we can help students be educated in a way that enables them to think better about ethical dilemmas. And it really means thinking. That is, the claim that it's part of the public mission of the university isn't simply the generic claim everybody ought to be ethical. It is the claim that to accomplish a more ethical society, to achieve this, takes
thinking. It takes what universities are distinctively good at. It takes analyzing the difficulties that are involved in an ethical relationship to certain scarce goods. What should be the policy of hospitals in relation to organ transplants? This is something that is not simply obvious if you have a good ethical orientation. It's a matter to be worked on in terms of different understandings of fairness, different ways of managing criteria and queuing relations, and so forth. Universities are distinctively good at analyzing some kind of environmental issues, some kind of ethical issues. And so these are important. We have the ability to advance knowledge through research, maintain knowledge, relationships through scholarship, to share knowledge in teaching. All the things that we commonly say are at the core of our mission are things that can be crucial public contributions. The more we think of our mission in terms of privatized contributions, right, the more we will slight some of these things. And to wind up a relatively long talk in this, not go on at too much length about this, we face, as universities, a set of choices that we can influence. We can't shape and control the whole direction of social change, but we can be involved in public access to knowledge. With the growth of the internet, right, we are in a position to have some influence. Now, we can say, well, in our deliberations, we are only going to value refereed publications in English language journals, preferably in the United States, preferably by certain professional societies with high impact factors, right? And we can participate in a growing problem, a tension, that is signaled by the following statistic. The average article in a US-based refereed social science journal is cited 0.9 times ever. Right? So that if we think publication of scientific knowledge is a matter of communication, right, we might want to question some of how we think about it. On the other hand, when governments mandate things, as the British government's recently tried to do, like open access publication, all results of research funded in any way by the British government must be published open access, then it matters a lot how open access is organized. How has it been organized there, and how is it increasingly being organized throughout the world? As a matter of paying those same journals to make work open access. That is something universities could organize themselves to accomplish, open access to scientific knowledge. We are basically saying, well, never mind, we'll let for-profit private publishers own the circulation of knowledge. And if we're required to have open access, since we want to publish in the American Political Science Review, the American Sociological Review, the American Economics Review, what we will do is work on a system that pays them, or in some cases, Elsevier, De Gruyter, or a variety of publishers, to make the work open access. So the mechanism by which there's open access, a good thing, open access, is hugely distorting on scientific work. If one of the impacts of this is increasing exclusion of work from outside relatively rich countries where scientific foundations pay for that transfer. Right? That's without taking into account the bias of English language publication. That is, work should be made available globally, whether it has an impact in its own country of origin or not. Okay? Changing the playing field. And I've tried to stress, and I've said it over and over again through these remarks, there's no simple good, simple bad, but we need to worry over the mechanisms, right? In our control, open access, how we evaluate people for promotion and so forth. We have the opportunity to work on this. Intellectual property regimes. As producers of science, we are in the position of shaping intellectual property. There has been an enormous shift towards a highly privatized and relatively just a different system for organizing intellectual property in recent years, with deleterious effects in many ways on science, right? As certain fields of science are able to prosper and others not, and certain kinds of research and not the longer term. So it's not a question of whether, in general, right, we can somehow do away with state influence. I predict almost nowhere will universities be powerful enough to do that. or whether we can do away with market influence, even Harvard with its $35 billion endowment, can't do that. The question is whether we are willing to be serious about how we work in our teaching, in our production of new knowledge, and in scholarship, in the extent to which we are repositories of knowledge that we share in various ways, to remember a public mission. It's a public mission that ought to shape how we think about teaching as much as how we think about intellectual property rights. Teaching is probably the biggest public impact that most academics will ever have, not their occasional appearances on TV. Okay? We shape the future through this. It's a public mission because it creates public goods, but it creates public goods to the extent we make it create public goods by encouraging our students to develop an understanding of knowledge and how it's advanced through critical debate, through deeper intellectual reflection, through sharing it. Because if science, and for that matter, humanistic and artistic and other knowledge, isn't shared, it not only doesn't have its impact, it doesn't advance as well. We can't improve knowledge very well if we hoard it, okay? If we restrict its flow. So being committed to a public mission means being committed to knowledge as a public good, and it means letting that shape how we organize all of our work. I'm happy to be saying this at Boğaziçi because I suspect I'm partly talking to a converted audience that believes in this. But I want to end by saying you should work harder, as I say to my faculty at the LSE, right? Because although we believe in it, most of us stop with saying that we believe in it, and we don't do all the hard work to reform the institution so that its public mission stays constantly front and center. I applaud you for having done way better than most. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Calhoun. We may open the floor for questions and discussion if there are any questions.
I'm in the political science department here, and surprisingly, it's my first week as a new faculty member for the next year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I'm an LSE graduate, so it's also an honor.
Double congratulations.
Thank you. To see you here as well. And it was an inspiring talk, and I have 10,000 questions, but I will just limit it into two. One of the first things that you mentioned is about just made me think a bit too much about the public space and in terms of the universities trying to distance themselves from the societies they're in. I find it quite difficult being in Turkey, and historically being a master's and a PhD student. My PhD was from Oxford, so you pretty know how historically from 12th century, 13th century onwards, it was nearly impossible to distance the university from the social and political and economic consequences of the society that was changing. So I find it a bit idealistic that it is possible, but realistically, I don't think that it is possible. Historically, it wasn't possible. And in a country like Turkey, I find it a bit difficult as well. That's one question. And the second one is about the future for the academic world. The realistic versus the idealistic understanding of distancing yourself as a university. And the second question is about the commercialization of the postgraduate programs in the world in general, and the increasing number of the postgraduate students and graduates afterwards, and there's actually not enough places in academia for those people. So I also find it a bit problematic with these research rankings of the universities, pushing universities into more limited spaces now in terms of autonomy, and how would you respond to these kind of constraints? Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to guess it's okay for me to be informal and take my coat off. Both questions are really good questions. Let me say on the first question, the ideal and the impossibility of distancing the university, that part of the problem is that distancing is the wrong metaphor. At the LSE, I like to point out we're right in the middle of London, and that reflects not just an accidental geography, but the founders of the university's desire to engage the world around, not to be in retreat in some beautiful city in the countryside with nice old buildings, but to be in the middle of the city. It creates problems for us, like every time we need more space, it's incredibly expensive. But it makes the university part of a global cosmopolitan city. That's partly metaphor and partly a material reality of what the university is about. I think the question is how we engage and how we balance factors to create a semi-autonomy. So the ideal of distancing sets up an unmeetable ideal. The university should be a retreat sheltered from social pressures. And it should then do science and do knowledge and so forth. And then periodically you have students saying, and it should be relevant. And it should do things that matter, and we should be protesting, and there should be an engagement with larger social issues. The university should be public in the sense of being part of creating public space. Part of what university campuses do is create a relatively protected, but only relatively protected space for public life. Right? That's not withdrawal. It's not distance entirely from the city or from the public issues or the challenges of the day. So I think we can adjust a bit our way of thinking about it and say the question is how to manage engagement and combine that, what I keep saying, relative autonomy, with managing intellectual quality in this so that we are restrictive in various ways. When we appoint new professors, we are selective. And students. But the restriction, right, isn't an infinitely good thing. It's up to a point because it enables us to have a relatively protected space. We are violating the trust on which that's based if we then just retreat into our own sort of monastic kind of tradition rather than finding ways to also be actively engaged with public issues. The pressures, then, have to be acknowledged, met, and challenged, partly by social change. That is, we may or may not be able to control things, but we're able to have some influence, and we should be trying to have influences in the direction of the conditions in which more public knowledge and sharing can thrive. The commercialization of postgraduate programs isn't a totally different thing. Postgraduate, it's commercialization in general. Postgraduate happens to be the big focus. So master's programs, taught postgraduate programs are the big commercial thing. So the rough structural position is PhD programs are pure cost everywhere. No university makes money on them. We do them because we like the future of knowledge that PhD students represent, and we like having students who are doing advanced work in our fields, and they have prestige influence in the school, but nobody does it for financial reasons. All right? Master's programs of various kinds, taught postgraduate programs, have turned out to be marketable as credentials. This has happened very largely, not entirely, but in the same period I'm talking about. And in a way, if I were talking for 5 hours, it would be a long talk about what changed in the world around the 1970s that produced these changes in higher education in various ways, an era of neoliberal financialization and so forth. The master's programs, a couple of things. Part of what produced the commercialization of master's programs was the mass expansion of bachelor's programs. It's the fact that the bachelor's degree lost some of its ability to confer distinction that produced a demand for master's degrees to do it. And then it got organized, of course, hierarchically at well. If you went to a less prominent university for your bachelor's degree, then going to a more prominent university for your master's degree was a way to extend it. If you went to a more local university for your bachelor's degree, going abroad for your master's degree. So this created a market niche that the universities could exploit. Some of them, the LSE, went very early and very effectively in exploiting this and being able to make it money-making opportunity for the university. The university didn't make a profit, but then it used that money to give PhD students scholarships and to recruit more faculty and so forth. Now, that machinery, I want to suggest, produced this commercialization, and it turns out that in the short run, it was in many ways good for the universities that did it, although it also distorted what they did and how the faculty work was. But in the long run, like any other market, it commodified something, and the commodity production allowed for a growing saturation of the market. That is, more and more universities could go into offering those master's degrees. And then eventually for-profit corporations like Laureate International, which is what Bill Gee had, could say, well, wait, there's a big business opportunity here, right? And the university in many ways loses the control of part of the public intellectual good it was providing as this becomes market. And note in the story, though, that the universities is partly an own goal. It's partly a self-inflicted wound, that we commercialized something which we did not end up completely controlling in the commercial market, and then it becomes a pressure. Now, that doesn't mean that these degrees aren't good or something, but it means that the pressures that drive it, the student enrollment, and so forth. It started out in the 70s with a variety of master's degrees, but there's a big shakeout in the master's degree world. The MBA wins as the #1 master's degree, and there are various other master's degrees tied to various other markets. So the master's in philosophy isn't a particularly marketable credential, right? Nobody hires you to think for them in that way, right? That sometimes, if it's from a prestigious enough university, it still works. Right? 30% of our people who get master's degrees in philosophies go to work in banking. They don't study banking at all, but it's the LSE and they get jobs in banking. Now, the point I'm making is that this is something that universities went into to meet their needs. They had to pay the faculty, they had to supply PhD students with support. We failed to figure out how to organize ourselves well, a collective action problem. And now, it's a large-scale commercial venture that's important to university budgets, that's hard to pull back from, but like publishing, is, I think, headed for a crisis in which the economic model that is so centered on fees paid for our taught postgraduate programs isn't going to work much longer. And the competition for those are going to be there. Very much like university presses, which where they exist are subsidized by universities, which are increasingly losing money, and we're sort of living on borrowed time from a major crisis of publishing. Our task isn't simply to judge this morally, but to sort of say, well, that's not going to work forever. How are we going to balance this revenue stream with others? How are we going to look at the future? And how are we going to try to avoid that sort of thing? Should I just go ahead, or are you going to point to people? Okay, you point to people.
Thank you. My name is Barış Karapınar. I am a research fellow at the Department of Economics. My question is about universities' influence on politics and policymakers as part of their public role. Obviously, LSE has a long tradition of influencing or projecting great influence on policy and policies and policymakers. For example, your former predecessor, Anthony Giddens, had a very close relationship with Tony Blair, mentoring him on the third way. Similarly, Stern, obviously Nicholas Stern's work on climate change has been very influential all around the world when it comes to policy making. But then obviously trying to influence politics or policymakers is a risky business, as experienced by various faculty members of LSE as they try to influence the Gaddafi regime's policies, which obviously stain the reputation.
You notice the censorship as soon as you start talking about Gaddafi.
So where do you draw the line in this? Should the universities be proactive, or should they be more should they take more cautionary approach? And finally, since you're in Turkey and since you're an expert on social movements, if you were to advise our Prime Minister, what would be your first advice? Thank you.
Well, just for the record, he hasn't asked me for any advice. And my first advice, I'd be quite clear about, I'm going to answer the question, would be don't overreact. And it's advice that I would say should apply whether one agrees with him or one doesn't agree with him on purely tactical level. Overreaction is really problematic. I think there has been overreaction, and I think overreacting is a problem. The bigger question about the influence on politics and policy. My view is that if universities, if our faculty, if we really believe that we have knowledge that matters, if we really believe that what we know is not just of idiosyncratic personal interest that matters, it should be shared. Now, as I said, the first mechanism of sharing should be teaching. So the number one commitment should be helping our students master all the knowledge that they will put to use in a variety of ways. And that will include, because it will come from multiple teachers, different angles on things. You know, one Marxist, one liberal, one a person who represents a purely secularist position, one who represents a more religious view. I think that students synthesize and put together, but that our job is first and foremost education, and they will go on in various ways with that, and we have to believe in the knowledge. We also get engaged in policy advice in various ways and in publicity for this. So it may be direct involvement in social movement campaigns. It may be advice to business corporations from management faculty. It may be advice to the government on one or another issues. And I think it's important that university intellectuals be able to do this. For universities, I think the first thing to recognize is that all of this requires management, requires decisions about how to do it. I don't just mean top-down management, I mean for the faculties to decide how to manage that. For example, what's the division of labor in a department or in any other unit in a university as a whole? How do you simultaneously recognize and reward high-profile public activity, right, and very deep scholarly research that results in important publications that are not immediately famous, okay? And yet may become influential over a 50-year period or something like that. So how do you reward simultaneously brilliant teaching of introductory classes that motivate students and the advising of PhD students in detailed research that requires a different kind of work in the field? We need to recognize that we are not all just stamped out of the same press, that we work with different abilities and they all need to be recognized. So I think universities have turned out to be bad at that lately, at least the ones I've been in, tend to have and are pushed to have more of a single-dimensional hierarchy of performance. And that single-dimensional hierarchy of performance tends to place a lot of emphasis on some external evaluations, getting grants or bringing in resources or certain things. And I think that's important to universities, but we need to balance that with other criteria, right? So that's just an example of managing it. So let me use the LSE and an example in that the up over Libya. It's not simply a matter of an individual, my predecessor or another, but of deciding of how decisions get made. Right, so how does a school work? It's a governance question. To what extent is there an internal discussion about what should be done in the school's name? To what extent is there not? Right? To what extent do people feel free to be critical in that discussion? Right? To say, no, I think that's a mistake, we shouldn't do it, even to the head of the institution. Right? And so that, again, back to the academic freedom, that's part of why we should value it, not only in the intellectual work, but to make good institutional decisions about what we do. Now, the decision will have to be made. Then there's the question of how you institutionally organize it. We've had a lot of discussions, as you might expect, at the LSE about ethics in the wake of that particular scandal. I think that this is very important, and it also, some of it misses a key point. The very important part is, of course, we should try to weigh the ethics and the implications, but missing the point is that invoking ethics, exhorting people to be ethical, misses that we create institutional frameworks and constraints. So as universities have pursued outside money, right? Mostly from their own governments, not foreign governments, but various kinds of outside money. They create occasions for distortion or possibly unethical behavior. For example, every time any center on a university is funded by a single funder, and the academic who's leading that center is invested in its future, he or she is very vulnerable to illegitimate pressure from that funder. Funded from 5 funders, it's more balanced. You're less likely to be distorted from one. There are a variety of ways in which we can set up our organizational system. If we know that we're going to have to take external money, right, set it up so that no funder has a distortive relationship. And there are norms and internal organizations to do that. And I think that's important. So I think in the LSE case, I admire both my predecessors for many things they did and ways in which they kept the LSE actively engaged. But I also hope that we will keep learning from mistakes and developing better institutional mechanisms for dealing with that. There's no negative answer to this, right? There's no answer that says, right, we shouldn't be giving advice. We're here to do that. There are answers around how we should manage that, reward that, create incentives or not. And that, I think, is very important to the university. I will add, we have this public influence in lots of ways. The highly visible parts of it are the media and more or less open relations to governments. We have it through the students. We have it in closed ways as people become consultants to business corporations in various ways. We have it through our writing and ways that, I talked about Friedrich von Hayek, one of the great intellectuals of the 20th century, whose writings also were marshaled into this highly individualistic sport of private property. The public influence happens in a lot of ways, and we should be aware that we have some collective capacity to organize this. And we shouldn't try to stamp it out, but we also shouldn't create an incentive system that says the best way for you to get ahead as an academic is to short-circuit this system in the interest of immediate gain.
Hi, and thank you for this very insightful and very informative talk. I'm in the sociology department, so when I hear you say that the university field as a whole and individual universities within that field are typically responding to multiple pressures and coming from different directions, and these various demands are at times contradictory, such that oftentimes there are no purely good options, and concurrently there are also no purely bad options available for university administrators such as yourself. It makes sense to me. I mean,
I hope there are no purely bad ones and that I don't fall into them.
So I get it. I mean, that's partly because my work is also on the fields of cultural production. But then again, when I think of my experience here in, well, just over 3 years, but also knowing a few things about, the history of universities in this country, the feeling I get is that we don't have competing demands so much as we have just one, really overbearing institution that, brings all these, really silly and contradictory demands on us. And the name of that institution is obviously the Turkish government. That is, until very recently, there was no such thing as a private Turkish university. And even today, their numbers are very small. And as public universities, we undertake, most of the, the business. We are the people who are taking care of education in this country, in essence. So what I'm wondering is, the implication from your talk is that there are no commandments for university administrators and for inhabitants of universities. There are no "thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that," but there are rather precepts. When doing this, also take into consideration this other thing and that other thing, and so on and so forth. But then again, in this country, I'm wondering if that could really be the case, or alternatively, whether there are really red lines for citizens of universities in places like this. Thank you.
So a good question, and you're right that I chose to stress what I think of as the things that we can do to partially control our situation, rather than those things that we would have to regard as the fatal red lines where we've so completely lost control of our situation that we have to just make a declaration. And I do think it that way. So the commands, precepts image is not bad, and I was sort of deciding on that. And I think that it's very largely true that for almost all problems, at least in early stages of those problems, there are multiple possible solutions, and being aware of that is a good thing. And recognizing that you may not be able to get plan A, but you can get plan B, and that's way better than plan C or something like that. And so most of the time, I think that's good advice. Are there occasions where there should be what you call red lines? That is, are there occasions where nothing should be crossed? Yes, I think there are occasions where people like me should be prepared to lose their jobs rather than do the wrong thing. And you should say that that would be a violation of academic freedom such that it cannot be accepted. That we're now not talking about giving grants unfairly in a way that biases one department versus another. We're talking about censoring an individual's academic work in a way that is unacceptable. So yeah, I do think there are red lines. As to the issue about the very disproportionate power of the Turkish state, I don't doubt it. Though I would suggest that the Turkish state, like all states, isn't simply a single voice. It may try to present itself very much that way, but there are multiple agendas and multiple parts, and that there are parts of the Turkish state that have a very strong economic agenda, which may be driving things even when they are presented in other terms. And that there are, that this isn't just monomaniacal pursuit of state power, a singular Islamist agenda, or economic modernization and growth, that there are various combinations of those things, and so there's still a kind of a balancing question, even when you're talking about the state. But I'm not an expert on Turkey, so I shouldn't be taken as inside expert. But a common feature to all of the things I would remark on, and in general my analyses of the issue of publicness, is that it's fairly fragile. That this has been something that we have often thought was just a feature of modern societies, that they had public spheres and the liberal democracy and various sorts of things. I think the possibilities of vibrant public life depend on social supports. They depend literally on physical spaces. They depend on metaphorical spaces in the media. They depend on the attitudes and culture, as you put it. They depend on legal frameworks and recognition. There are a lot of things, and it's relatively fragile. And we are among the guardians of this capacity because science and knowledge in the modern world depend on that. We've lost the battle if it collapses in any of these directions. And so the question about commodification, marketization of certain degrees, if we collapse into being just an economic organization as a way to defend ourselves against overburdening government power, we lose some of our capacity to preserve what we value just as much as we lose it if the government issues commands that are absolutely antithetical. Independent financing is part of that. And I will leave it to others to sort of determine what's up with the growth of private universities and the role of individual families in sponsoring them or different things in Turkey. There's an analysis to be done of the internal organization of higher education in Turkey that I'm not competent to do. But I will offer the assertion, the prediction, that if this analysis were done, that part of what we would find is the emergence of a hierarchical organization to all of this, in which one of the paradoxes is that being high in that hierarchy is the basis for a partial protection from the intrusions of external power. And so there's no way out of the bind. There's no perfect way out of this in which you can say, right, but we believe in total egalitarian perfect system and the ability to protect ourselves from external power. There's no such position.
I also would like to thank you for the very inspiring talk, and it brings to mind a number of things. But I would like to comment on the peculiarity of this institute a little bit, and maybe from there I can ask you to comment further on the publicness versus privateness. Historically, this university being coming from an American background is not famous, let me say, for its public mission, but rather famous for academic excellence, right? So I would like to tell this story from another angle, what this university has become in time, so to speak. And historically, we come from this liberal Anglo-Saxon thinking philosophy with a good deal of emphasis on the individual and competition, merit system, and so on. And we stood out with that among other Turkish universities, like the others in Ankara, for example, like the Middle East Technical University, and others had more publicly obvious public standing in the society. But in time, things have changed. And what happened, I think, what changed for Boğaziçi is we are becoming a university with more and more a public mission. And that with our emphasis on the freedom of the individual, on democratic values and free thinking, etc., now this is a time when these values around the individual, rights and freedoms around the individual have become very crucial at this society, that we have, I mean, private things have become public. So, I mean, could you comment a little bit on that, how to draw the line between private and public?
Very hard. I think it's an enormously important question, so I appreciate being asked it. To go in general on private and public is hard, but one thing I want to say is, if I could completely start the discussion over, which is impossible, I would try to get us away, I don't mean just today's discussion, I mean the whole discussion of public and private, the idea that there are only two choices, and they are public and private, and they're completely opposed, and which I think misses a variety of things. The extent to which free speech is simultaneously a public and a private good, for example. It's not opposed in a strict sense. We don't have rights of free speech because it is good for individuals as a sort of private property. We have rights of free speech because it's good for societies to have individuals able to speak freely as individuals. And so a way to recast that discussion that would recognize the extent to which the ability to have a good version of the private and a good version of the public depend on each other, which I think is very directly an answer to your question. I think and there are thinkers that we could adduce to this, John Dewey or Hannah Arendt, for example. Someone like Hannah Arendt saying the problem in modern mass society isn't the public or the private, it is the creation of systems of society that endanger both the good versions of the public and the good versions of the private. And I think that there's a lot to that. In the concrete case, I mean, you will know the history of Boğaziçi and Robert College better than me, but I would say recurrently in the history of this institution, standing for certain liberal values, in one sense the meaning of liberal, has been a public contribution. It was a public contribution at earlier periods as well in Turkey. And so when I spoke at the beginning about figuring out what it is from a tradition that one thinks is so valuable that you want to keep protecting that in new circumstances, it's the kind of thing I mean. The new circumstances to me are that in our current situation globally, particular version of it in Turkey and other versions elsewhere, affirming and taking seriously the public mission of universities isn't just a virtue. It's not just a nice thing. It's a condition of the continued existence of universities or an academic field. And for all of the flaws of the academic field, and I could go back to Pierre Bourdieu, who spent the first 30 years of his career criticizing and then spent 10 years trying to defend these fields. Right, so Bourdieu spent the years before 1995 attacking and saying, look, these fields aren't as equal as you think. And then, in the face of neoliberalism and what he saw as an over-American and over-influence of the US, saying, but these fields are something that we shouldn't just throw away. We should change them incrementally in good ways. We shouldn't throw them away. Well, I think the same with the academic field. Right now, it's very tied up with inequality. There are these various sorts of issues that are problems, but we shouldn't throw it away. And the condition of not throwing it away is going to be affirming something of this version of publicness, because the pursuit of and sharing of knowledge have to be defining goals. If they are reduced to instrumental things, it won't work. And instrumental isn't merely economic. If the government decides that there is a correct version of Turkish history, whether it was the Kemalist nationalist version or it's a new version, and that the job of historians is not to ask questions about the past, but to simply promulgate that correct version, that's a disaster. It's an instrumentalization of the work of the university that is incompatible with the continued intellectual success. So back to, yes, Boğaziçi pursued academic excellence, but the pursuit of academic excellence depended on a variety of conditions and terms, like not having the obligation only to teach an authorized version of history, to stick to that example. And for me at least, I worry about only celebrating the value of academic excellence without making clear that we mean free circulation of ideas, and which is both public and individual, right? It's creating a public possibility of the circulation of ideas that depends on the liberty of individuals to speak their minds. And if we don't defend that, if we say, no, it's only for advancing the economy and technology, or only for supporting the state through the teaching of the right version of national history, or whatever, then we instrumentalize, right? And that's really the enemy, turning intellectual life, teaching, research, all of intellectual life, into merely an instrumental set of mechanisms for accomplishing various short-term goals of others, rather than creating the arena in which they can thrive and be the source of creativity that is a huge public good.
In this day and age, and given all your experiences in different institutions, what do you think is the best ownership structure for a university? A public one, a privately owned,
Right.
self-managed,
Right.
or a mixture? Which mixture, if that is?
Good question. So, the question is, what's the best ownership structure? I'd say the key issue here is the governance structure, and the ownership structure can influence it, but it's not the whole thing. So universities that are formally state-owned are granted varying levels of autonomy to manage their own affairs, so that ownership doesn't dictate the result exactly. Similarly, private can mean private for profit. It can mean run as a charity organization essentially on its own. So the LSE is incorporated, is essentially under the charity laws in Britain. It's publicly regulated by the state, it's self-owning in a certain sense. So I like the idea of, in some ways, cooperatively self-owning. But what I would stress is that ownership doesn't tell the whole story. It's the governance terms of operation, which, and different ones are compatible with different outcomes in that. There is some move around the world, and I think here, for government owners to wish to exert more governance control. And I think that that is often productive of one version of what I was describing as the instrumentalization or short-circuiting of the model. On the other hand, I think faculty-run universities are often slightly naive about the issues they confront, and that if there is a desire to protect a fair amount of autonomy in the collective decisions of the university, you can't afford to be naive. You have to really look at some difficult challenges in that and not be entirely look at the past through rose-tinted glasses. For example, we often speak about the history of faculty democracy and forget that the history of faculty democracy often involved a handful of male professors making all the decisions or something in universities. It wasn't always quite as democratic. Universities became more democratic sometimes by changing their structures internally. If we're going to keep faculty control in the areas where we need it, we may have to keep evolving institutional structures. But I resist saying that ownership is completely determinative or that I have a best model, except that if I allowed myself to be naively idealistic, I would prefer a self-owning cooperative.
Okay, I think this has been an excellent start for our Boğaziçi lectures. We once again thank Professor Calhoun.
Thank you. Thank you. Good questions.